Thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar from Stage Plot to Doors in 5 hours or less, presented by Dustin Dunsmore. My name is Laura Lawrence and I'm the Global Director of Marketing at Harman. Just a few things before we get started. You might have noticed that everybody is muted on the call. You can send in your questions through the chat feature and we'll consolidate those and get them over to the presenter to answer at the end. This webinar is going to be recorded and the link will be made available a few days after the presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control. And we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional University to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to Dustin Dunsmore, the presenter for today's webinar. Since 2012, Dustin Dunsmore has served as Master Technician for the Terrace Theater at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. His past roles include Production Electrician for the Washington Ballet, Master Electrician for Glimmerglass Opera, and Staff Electrician at Wolf Trap National Park. And now I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Dustin.
Thank you. Hello and welcome. So to give a little background, I wanted to talk about the Terrace Theater. The Terrace is a small venue. We have 2 staff technicians that are here all the time that are responsible for all technical aspects of the theater, but we expand up to 14 for big shows. In my role here, I do lights, I do video, obviously front of house. But when I'm doing front of house or anything, my attention is always split as I'm responsible for anything. So what I'm going to try to do in this seminar is give a sense of how to accomplish that. I say that I didn't set out to be an audio person, so I think my approach is a little bit differently. Our venue does a wide variety of acts. We have everything from hip-hop to jazz to Broadway cabaret, opera, dance, orchestra, chamber music, award shows, corporate events, movie premieres, international music festivals, and just about anything you could think of. We kind of have a different show every night. So there's a lot of unique things and specific needs for each type of performance, but there is a lot of overlap, and that's what I want to cover, things that you can put in place to make your day easier. Assumptions for this seminar are going to be that we have a known room, which is a 500-seat theater. We have a known PA and unknown artist, and that's going to be the biggest change, is that it's a different artist every day, and they are new to us. For this seminar, we're going to use a small jazz group as an example. It's indicative of something we do pretty regularly, and it's a manageable number of inputs for us to talk through with enough variety. So I wanted to tell you about the house PA, which is one of our assumptions. This is a picture of the Terrace Theater, which was renovated in 2017. The house PA consists of 4 Vertec 4883 subs, which are flown left and right. There are 23 individual Vertec 4886 boxes, which are our line arrays. We have a left array, a right array, a center, and a delay. Our front fills are the Control 23-1s, and there are 12 of those. All of that is powered by 5 Crown high-tech 4x3500 amps. One of the things that makes my job simpler and makes this room simpler is that all of the processing, all of the amplifier processing, all of the room processing happens within the amplifiers themselves. So we use Performance Manager to do all of that inside the amps. There's no outboard gear. And it just makes all of that setup so much simpler. I want to talk about the philosophy of getting to a good sound. This is my kind of 3-leg stool philosophy of how I know I've gotten to where I need to be. First things first, we have to get to good. We have to make it sound good first. That means a lot of different things, but on the most basic level, it means that for every input there is clear sound, there is no hum, there's no noise, there's no feedback, we have pleasant sound, and we don't have resonant frequencies causing issues. So the first thing we have to do before we can make anything sound amazing is it has to sound good and professional and presentable. Okay, great. So what I was talking about was having a general philosophy of how we know we've gotten good sound. And like I said, first things first, we have to make it sound good. It has to be clean, no feedback, no issues. The next thing is we have to hear everything. And how we achieve that is a couple different ways. But what I try to do and what I'm going to show you techniques of is creating a place for each input, for each instrument, and creating that place in the frequency, in space, and in time. And then we're going to talk about making sure the sound, that it sounds like it looks. Does the sonic image match the stage? I think there can be a real problem of cognitive dissonance when what you hear doesn't match what you see. Having these three pillars can be incredibly useful when what you're mixing is unfamiliar. If you're mixing a type of music that you've never heard before or that you're not familiar with, it's hard to know when it sounds good. So I think having this basic philosophy gives you a sense of a place to get to. When preparing for a show, I like to think in 2 units of time. There's the unit of time before the band arrives, and then there's once the band gets here. I like to say on a good day, I have done all the hard parts before the band arrives. Before the band gets there, I'm on my time. The time pressure isn't quite as intense as it is. Once the band arrives, I feel like it's my job to get out of the way and help them put on a great show. So first things first, I'm going to go to the paperwork stage. This is going to be weeks and days before the show. Kind of the foundational document, the first thing I tend to see is a stage plot. This is often accompanied with a very long rider, but the stage plot is what I'm going to use to get a lot of my information about how we're going to achieve this show. So this is an example of a pretty standard jazz setup that we'll see. There's a piano, a keyboard, acoustic bass with an amplifier, a drum set, a guitar, and a vocalist. Once I have that, I'm then going to reach out to whoever I can get a hold of to try to get more information. And this is in the days and weeks before the show. I'm going to try to find out if there's a manager who's traveling with the group, or perhaps even an engineer who wants to mix the show, or has strong thoughts about how the show is mixed. I want to find out who is listening to soundcheck. Oftentimes no one. Oftentimes the band just has trust in you to make them sound good, but that's not always the case. And it's good to know ahead of time and meet that person before anything could become contentious. What you don't want to have happen is have a whole sound check and then find out that their good friend was in the house for it, and as you need to break the crew for dinner, they're telling you they hated the way everything sounded. So trying to get a sense of who's listening ahead of time is really useful. It's also essential to figure out the experiences and expectations of the group before they walk in the door. This is an issue we have a lot, as we have a wide variety of acts that come through our door. We have everything from NEA jazz masters and Broadway stars who you put a microphone in front of them, set a game, and you can kind of get out of the way. They know how to use a mic. To community groups and international groups and other groups who are not professional musicians. They're going to have very different expectations and very different understandings of how sound technology works. 2 examples, one of the last shows we did, Tim McGraw was here for an award show. Needed very little work from us, very little help. And my first show here, I got asked to mic a talking dog and then got a bunch of EQ notes because they thought they couldn't understand what the dog was saying. So it takes all kinds, and I think it's important to know who is going to come in and what you can do to help them. Not necessarily part of my responsibility, but essential is arranging backline. So I always want to figure out who's doing that and make sure that gets taken care of. The last thing you want to do is come in for the day and realize that none of the percussion is there. I also try to take this time to figure out if there's going to be any gear that's coming with them or that we're going to rent that could be problematic, and try to iron out some of that ahead of time. Something that comes to mind from my experience is a Hammond B3 organ and Leslie. We, at this point, have a couple people on staff who are really good at fixing the pedals for a Hammond, but very rarely does that all work when it first shows up. Another thing that comes up a lot nowadays are digital DJ rigs. And more often than not, the digital DJ rig will be rented from a vendor. The DJ will show up with their laptop. Now, if they don't show up before doors, you'll often end up having to hold doors or have the first half of your show be the DJ trying to get the laptop to talk to the digital mixer. So anything you can do ahead of time to try to avoid that is a good thing for you. And then the last thing is what's missing. I have this here because sometimes you can read through a whole rider, you can talk to people, and then it shows up on the day and there's a massive piece of gear or a thing that they expected or needed that wasn't written down anywhere. So I like to ask somebody, it's like, hey, when you've done this before, what's something that you didn't have that could have been really useful? Maybe it's something that is listed in the rider, but it doesn't seem very important, or it's something that they just assume everyone has. So after that, I think the next thing to do is to do your own homework. The band is not the only place to get information. Streaming music services can make it incredibly easy to listen to almost any band. This is really useful if you have a band or a genre you're not familiar with, or a really high-profile event. You can start listening to that music days, weeks out, and even if it's not actively listening, having that in the back of your head, even subconsciously, I think can be really helpful on the day of. Part of you already knows what it's supposed to sound like. YouTube can be a great asset for figuring out how a band actually sets up. Do they really set up like it's drawn in the stage plot? Are there special guests that are often to come out and maybe that's not listed anywhere? So YouTube is another great example. The last good example is colleagues, reaching out to colleagues who have worked with a band before. I like to say that being forewarned is being forearmed. Once we've gathered all that information, we kind of have everything we can. Now it's on us to make our paperwork. The foundational document, I think, is the input list, and I think it's essential to have a framework that you always try to use. So I always try to keep it simple, keep the simplest miking techniques I can use, but the caveat to that is that it's way easier to remove or not use a mic than it is to try to wire something in during sound check. So I like to say if you don't know where you're going, you better pack a lot. After we come up with our input list, the next thing we need to figure out is monitoring, and I like to make a monitor list at this point too. The big question for monitors is the monitoring something that can be done from the front of house console, or is a separate monitor desk needed? There's a lot of different things that can determine the answer to this question. Sometimes it's as simple as how complicated is the show. If it's a limited number of inputs, limited number of monitors, then not a problem to do it front of house. Other times, the complexity of the show requires an additional engineer, or sometimes it's just written into the group's rider that they must have an additional engineer on monitors. So with that information, I'll go ahead and make my input list, as you can see here. Talking through this is the input list that I use for everything. I keep this formatting the same no matter the size of the show, whether it's a 5-person group or a 60-person orchestra. My input list is always going to look the same. On the left, we see the input itself, and then we have the actual mic used. We can see the stand that's used. Oh, let me go back. Sorry about that. We can see the stand that is used for that instrument. With just those 3 columns, I can hand this piece of paper to any staff member, anyone who's working with me, and they can start building microphones. Another column I have is the when. This becomes really useful as things expand and get more complicated. When I have multiple bands, when I have an award show with multiple different acts, having the when each thing gets used becomes really, really essential. And then at the far right column is the monitors. So now I have my input list, and following are 2 examples that prove the point that no plan survives first contact. As you can see, there's Sharpie marks and everything. We'll start the day with a clean input list, but then as things go on, everything changes a little bit. These are from bigger shows. So that's pretty much everything we do before the show. One of the natures of the Terrace Theater is that there's a show almost every night. So there's very little things, physical setup things you can do without being in the way of the current show. So now we've gotten to the day of the show, and we will start by setting up the stage. First thing we'll do is we're going to set all the backline, we're going to set the mics, We're going to set the mic stands. This is a really critical time and I think often underappreciated. We're going to take the time at this point to set up our best case scenario for mic placement, not just for the audio aesthetics of mic placement, but to reduce feedback and to keep our monitor volume out of mics. There's a chance that what you set up is what runs. So if you can set yourself up for success now, it's a great use of that time. When possible, I try to lay out mic mults and minimize XLR cable runs as much as I can. Neatness really counts at this point. A little investment in cable management and planning can pay dividends when you inevitably need to change things. Labeling. So this is when I get made fun of by people who work with me. I love labeling. And I think you can't over-label. So if you come into a show that I'm working on, you'll see that the breakout boxes are labeled, the monitors are labeled, even the mic stands are labeled. When time allows, I believe in labeling anything you can. I have never once been disappointed that I labeled something. This is especially useful and important when the band inevitably arrives and everything changes. If you have labeled all the pieces of your puzzle, you can take it apart and rebuild the puzzle. If you haven't labeled anything or haven't labeled it to a high degree, it becomes much harder because instead of just reassembling already designed pieces, now you're trying to figure out what you had when you started. So again, with labeling, I used to be a production electrician, so that's where my sense of labeling comes from. If you were to walk into my amp room, you would see that every single piece of gear that's on the network has a label with its IP address, with its HiQNet address, with its device name, etc. So that if I need to swap anything out, I don't have to think, I don't have to pull up a note from later. It's all right there on the device. I think clear, concise, and detailed labeling really empowers others to help you troubleshoot. If you're the only one who understands the big picture, you're the only one who can fix it. So labeling everything really helps other people help you, as it allows that information to be disseminated. That is the physical setup that we can do. We can set up our mics, we can set up our stands, we can get as ready for the band as we can before they show up. So the next step is all going to be things that we do on the console to make our day easier. Here at the Terrace Theater, we have a Soundcraft VI 400. We updated a 4 to 400 after our renovation in 2017. I have a Madi in and out card from my local rack, which sits right behind me. There's a fiber optic connection from the local rack to the stage box, which is in our amp room. And our stage box sits on the primary output of a three-way copper splitter. We also have a VI1 for monitors, which has a dedicated stage box, and that sits on the first isolated output of our splitter. First thing I'm going to do is my labeling. Back to labeling again. My channeling philosophy, and I talked a little bit about this on the input list, is to keep things one-to-one whenever possible. And what I mean by that is that my splitter 1 goes to my console input 1, and that is channel 1, and so on down the line. So mic input 18 hits channel 18, is splitter 18. I know that's not necessarily a conventional workflow, but I find it to be incredibly useful and saves a lot of problems down the line, especially in the scenario we get into often where we have multiple operators and multiple consoles all working on the same show. So if we have a front of house console, a monitor console, and a record console, and they all have different channel numbers for the same input, just figuring out your vocabulary becomes half of your troubleshooting. So I'm going to always try to keep that one-to-one patch idea. And I think the VI has a couple of really great features to make that possible. The first one is the user page setup. So I'm going to try to use my user pages to get the faders where I want them. So this is a picture of the user page, the shuffle buttons, and how we assign faders to our user pages. So I want to utilize my user pages to put the faders in the right place, not assigning different inputs to different channels, but keeping my channels matched my inputs and using my user pages to put the faders where I want them. So I think when you're mixing a show, your attention is a limited resource. So laying out your console that in a way that you never have to search for a fader can really be huge. So my lead vocal is always going to be on my left hand right here. My drums are always going to be to my left. You know, you're going to have your own way of working, but making sure that that tracks all the time, the user pages become an incredible tool for doing that. Some ideas for user pages. In a festival, I'll often have different acts on different pages. So let's say the opener is going to be on user page 1, the middle act is going to be on user page 2, and the headliner is going to be on user page 3. If I have a really big show, let's say a modern orchestra with 60 inputs plus, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that first page for the things that I'm going to have to actively mix during the show. My vocals, anything dynamic, anything that I think I'm going to have to really finesse as the show goes. That might include groups on that first page. And then anything that's going to be more of a set it and forget it, I'm going to set a level and not have to worry about it during the show. I'm going to bury those on subsequent pages. Working through our channel strip, just down from our input side is going to be our high and low pass. We're going to work down the channel strip as we go through the console setup. So we see the audio spectrum to the left, and all the instruments kind of laid out where they exist. We're going to use our high-low pass to start creating that place for each instrument, each input. And we're going to use this to create the place in frequency. So I think it's incredibly useful, incredibly helpful to get rid of the frequencies that you don't need ahead of time. There are a lot of things that are not going to produce anything under 100 hertz, so just don't even bring it into the channel strip. You don't need it. Broadly cutting away unhelpful frequencies now can help carve out that space. It also saves you from having to clean up a muddy sound later. You can't EQ before you hear the input, but you can get rid of things you don't need. So a couple examples of how I use that. A really common example I think everybody is familiar with is a high pass or a low cut. Anything that doesn't have information at those lower frequencies, we can just cut that out to be clean. This is a high pass for a vocal mic. Something I often do when I have drum overheads is I'll take a pretty aggressive high pass because for those mics, all I really want is that cymbal sound. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of anything that isn't those cymbals. I'll just knock that out ahead of time, and that's going to save me from having to worry about getting other drum sounds in those overheads, which I don't want. This is somewhat unconventional, but it's a trick I've used a couple times to good effect, and it is for a dual mic piano setup. So a piano setup where you have two mics on a piano, a high and a low. The AKG 4099 and the 4021 are great examples of magnetic mic kits that can sit inside a piano, one picking up the high end, one picking up the low end of the piano. Using the high and low cut are a great way to just dial out the sound you don't need in each mic. So on the high mic, I don't want any of that low end sound, so I'm just going to dial it out before it even gets to the channel strip. And the same thing on the low mic. I'm going to cut all the high frequencies that I don't want in that input. Going down from the EQ section is our compressor section and our dynamics. I find the compressor dynamics are the first tool we have to create a space in time for an input. When I say that, I mean that each sound exists for a certain length of time, and trying to have discrete timings for each thing can be useful and is a controllable quality. So what I'm going to do with these compressors is I don't want to have all these things firing before I hear anything, but what I want to do is I want to, back to my suitcase metaphor, pack them so that when the band shows up, they're already in place. I can turn them on, I can turn them off, I can start messing with them. But what I'm not going to do is try to find them, try to dial all that in ahead of time once they're here. So it's pretty common, I think, after doing this for a while, after mixing shows for a while, that you'll have a vocabulary of dynamics that are useful to you as starting points, and those are what you can get in ahead of time. The first one I want to show is a vocal compressor. So this is a vocal compressor that I've roughed in. I probably won't engage it before the sound check, but I'll have it in place. Another one here is a gate on a snare drum. I think this is a gate is a great way to talk about that creating a space and time, because what the gate's going to do is only allow that input to be open for a short amount of time. So it's going to shorten the length of time that sound is available to us and create a smaller window for that. After our dynamics are roughed in, I'm going to go to my stereo, to my panning, and I'm going to try to have a coherent image to start, a coherent audio image to start with before sound check. And the first thing I'm going to do is use my stereo pairing to simplify my control. I'm then going to use the visual layout of the stage to set other pans, and the goal here is to make the show sound like it looks. The stereo pairing, I think, is a really nice tool, a really nice feature. One of the things that's really useful, I think, is often overlooked, is that it can be a great way to simplify the amount of faders that are under your fingers, a great way to simplify your control. By stereo pairing things, you can take 2 faders and drop them down to 1. This is great for keyboards. If you have a show with 3 keyboards instead of 6 faders, now you just have to deal with 3. And this is where, putting them on user pages comes in handy. This feature saves fader real estate on bigger shows. I'm going to do that with my keyboards for this demonstration, and also on my drum overheads. After I have my pairings done, the next thing I'll do is I'll take my individual channels and change the panning to kind of match what we set up on stage and to match the stage plot, so that I have a place to start with a stereo image. After the stereo, the next thing, kind of the last thing I'll set up on the input side is going to be some basic effects. Basic effects, again, this is going back to creating a place in time for things. I'm going to set up 2 effects for most shows, sometimes more, but 2 reverbs is what I most often use. One for musical sounds and one for vocals. Reverb helps create that place in time by extending the time a sound is heard, making it a little bit bigger. And I want to go back to talk about the way the Lexicon Effects are built into the VI series and how useful that is. As you can see on the channel return, there's a click box for the effect, and all of your parameters are right there at the channel level, as opposed to dealing with outboard gear. Everything is at your fingertips the whole time. You don't really have to look away from the stage like you would if you were patching through some outboard gear. It's all right there at the channel strip level. So that is everything on the input side we can do ahead of time. Next, I want to talk about the output side and things we'll do on the output. The first big question is, how do we get to the PA? We've gotten all our channels into the console, but now we need to get them out of the console. The most simple method, or a simple method, is to have a matrix for each send. For this example, and these are actually the matrices I use in the Terrace Theater, we have 5 matrices. We have a subs, which is a stereo send, a left and right array, which is also stereo, a center, and a delay, which are mono, and our front fills, which are stereo. The first thing to do, or for this simple setup, what we'll do is we're just going to assign the left and right bus to each matrix. So this is the matrix assign window, and we're just going to choose the left and right and assign it to each of the matrices. And we're going to use the level of the send to each matrix to balance the room. So this level, as it hits each matrix, we can use to make the room balance. At that point, once we've done that balancing, all we need to do is make a good stereo mix, and we have our show. This is done with the matrix outputs at Unity. That way, during the show, if we need to change the room balance, we can adjust the matrix outputs. The more complex version, and I give credit to Raul Gonzalez on this, is, again, we're going to have a matrix for each send, but we're going to do things a little differently. we're going to assign all of the inputs to groups, so everything's going to hit a group first. No inputs go straight to the left-right bus. We're going to have all of our music groups, they're going to mix down to left-right. We're going to have our vocal group or groups remain separate. Each matrix is going to get the left-right bus and the vocals independently. We're going to make sure that no vocals hit the subs. Compression can be added at any stage in this. So the first thing we need to do is to create our groups. The most basic version of this, and we can have a lot more groups, but the most basic version is to just use 2 groups, one group for our music and another group for our vocals. None of the inputs are going to go to left, right. We have these 2 main groups. We can see here, this is our piano input. This is the piano input being assigned to the music group, and it is not in the left, right. This is our all bus view, how we view all of the buses in the console. We can see here that the music group, which is on the left, is mixing down to the left, right, and the vocal group remains separate. This is all about setting up this system. What we're then going to do is, going back to how we set up the sends to the matrices in the previous example, we're going to now add the vocals. We're going to add that vocal group to each matrix. So again, our matrices, our outputs for this room are our subs, our array, our center, our delay, our front, and our front fills. By having the vocal group remain separate, each matrix gets both the music and the vocal group independently. So what we can do is we can walk the room and change the balance of the vocal and the music for each location in the room. And it's also a great way to keep the vocals out of the subs. Another advantage of this is that each stage of that system allows us to add compression and dynamics and EQ. We can do it at the channel stage, we can do it at the group stage or multiple group stage, and we can do it at the bus stage. The relationships between the instruments and vocals are preserved at the output stage, but they can also be adjusted for each zone. It's a complicated setup, but it's a thing you can set up once and it just lives in your show file and allows so much flexibility down the road. We talked about monitors, and sometimes we mix monitors from front of house. I think the cleanest way to do that, if it's available, is to double up the channels. So what I mean by that is we're going to have separate channels with the same input that are going to be our monitor channels. And what that's going to allow us to do is almost have 2 consoles. We're going to have the console that's mixing front of house in that group of channels, and then another set of channels that's just going to be dedicated to the monitors. This is where the fader flip function can come in really useful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my setup. I'm going to pick unused channels. In this example, I think I used 31 through 38, and I'm going to assign the same inputs to those channels. If you see it down in the right corner, the console will display an A or B to show that that channel is used in more than one place. I want to make sure that those virtual channels are not routed to the left, right, and that they're only going to the monitors where I want them to. I'm going to then use my user page setup and assign those monitor channels on a separate page. Ideally, I put them just below the front of house channels. So if my kick drum was the farthest to my left, my kick drum monitor would be right beneath it, so that when I'm flipping pages, it tracks and it does the same thing, and I can see what I'm doing. One of the things about this console that I find really useful when I'm mixing a show, and I'm starting to get a little things are starting to move really fast, is a feature called fader glow. You can see in this picture the faders are glowing orange, and what that is that's telling me that I'm not mixing to front of house. Anytime you're mixing to something other than the left-right bus, the faders will glow a different color to give you kind of a warning that you're not mixing to left-right. The orange is that is showing you the contributions to an auxiliary. The red is showing you that the console has become a graphic equalizer. and the blue, I believe, is the matrix. Another really nice thing about mixing monitors on this console and about the auxiliaries is that each bus of the console has a graphic and a parametric EQ, as well as dynamics built straight into that bus. So when you're doing monitors and you need to actually EQ the box of the monitor itself, all of that is already there at the output level for you to do. Recording is something that comes up quite a bunch. I'm going to talk about 3 basic options for recording. This first one is something that I have in place all the time. I call this my page program mix. And what it is it's a post-fade auxiliary, typically my aux1, with every single channel set at unity and post-fade so it's following my live mix. I set this in place so I never have to think about it. It's my mix with some flexibility. So it's everything I'm sending to the PA, but if a stage manager, if someone needs a little something, I can, turn up the trumpet, I can turn up the lectern mic to a particular, for that mix. I can route this anywhere, and it's a great for use for an emergency recording if somebody needs to archive or something. The next option is using the Madi features. I call this Easy Multitrack. So the Madi outputs, I'm going to set a direct out from each channel in use. This is all part of my console setup that's just always there. I don't have to think about it. But from each channel, I'm going to have a direct out to my Madi card, and you can see it's a Madi Face USB that is my Madi device, and that's going to allow me to record basically the sound that's coming into the head amps and get that to an external device to be processed later. The last and probably the most complicated way we record a show is to use our copper splitter and give the full access to the show, to all 56 channels in our splitter via a W4. So that is all of the console setup that we're going to do, everything that we can put in place ahead of time to help us out once the band shows up. Before we walk away, before we're ready for a band, we need to do a line check. Everything must work and sound good before, I don't want to have a musician on stage before I know that everything works. I want to complete a line and mic check for all inputs to all desks, for the front of house, for the monitors, for the recording. I need everybody to know that everything sounds good and is working. Even if we have to change everything, even if every single mic, every single input changes during the course of the day, at least we verify that our routing to all the devices is good, which is sometimes half the battle. I'd like to say the goal is to never have to troubleshoot your system in front of the band. It's just not fair to them. It's not a great look. So you want to have everything working before anyone else shows up, before the musicians show up. Sometimes there is no band sound check, or sometimes you have some extra time and you can get some sound check in before you get a band. Even if you don't have backline, you can ring out your vocal mics. Lots of different methods to do this, but one great way is to set up a graphic EQ and get as much gain as you can before feedback. Have that in your back pocket for when you need it. You can put that across a group, or you can do that on an individual channel level. If you do have some backline, you can set a basic gain for each input. You can listen for problematic frequencies and start dealing with them before you're trying to do musical. So that is all the things we can do before the band arrives. Next, we have the band coming in. I like to think that it's my job to help them do the best show possible. So I'm going to try to facilitate. I like to think of it as being a facilitator. This is our mantra. It's all going to change, and that's okay. I think one of the most heard phrases in live sound is somebody looking at you and saying, "Where did you get that rider? We haven't used that in years." So you set up everything, and now it's time to change it all. I think as a front of house engineer, as an audio person, your job when a band shows up is to gain their trust as soon as possible. So a couple tips for that: I like to walk away from the console and greet them. I like to talk to the band in person. I hate it, and the day never goes well when our first encounter is yelling from the back of the house or talking on a God mic. Establishing that personal connection as soon as you can really help in gaining that trust. I think I try to never be afraid and try to not let my ego be my enemy. So I try not to be worried about asking a band how to do something. If a band's touring every single night of the week, they probably have some pretty great ideas about how to achieve certain things that you might not be familiar with or you might not be 100% on. So never a bad idea to ask how to mic something, how to set something up. And man, if they make a suggestion, do it. It doesn't have to be what you use in the final mix, but it has to be a place to start to establish that trust as soon as you can. Making the musicians happy is the sooner you can do that, the better. So to that end, I think getting the monitors dialed first is essential. A couple different ways we like to do it. What I prefer to do is to ask each musician individually what they want to hear and kind of dial that in. If I'm mixing it from front of house, I'm going to want to have an iPad or a remote so I can go down and listen to what they're hearing as opposed to not knowing. So I want to hear the same thing they're hearing. If that doesn't work out, if for whatever reason the complexity of the show doesn't allow that, or I have a monitor engineer who's doing so much that they can't leave the desk, what we're going to do is we're going to have a crew member who has a headset on and is going to go talk to those musicians and have a face-to-face conversation, then try to relay that back. It just always seems to work better than shouting or even talking into a God mic. Having someone dialogue face-to-face just seems to be a better way to go. And again, if we're doing monitors from front of house, having set it up for the double channels, it's like we have two desks. So if we have that iPad, we can work on things without affecting the front of house sound. So for sound check proper, what I'm going to try to do is as soon as they're on stage and we've got them happy and they're noodling, I'm going to try to get as much listening and as much work done while they're kind of setting up and noodling. You can learn a lot about what something sounds like while they're warming up, while they're tuning. I'm going to try to get the band to play together as soon as possible. In my humble opinion, the kind of traditional sound check where everybody plays each individual instrument solo tends to not be as useful as getting a whole band to play together. Admittedly, it can be chaotic if you're not set up for it, but if you've done all the work ahead of time and you have a lot of things in place, getting them all to play together and getting those actual dynamics of how they're going to play during the show can be really great. Same thing for monitors. You can spend hours having people individually say things about, this player, I want a little more of this and do that. But until they're all playing together, it kind of doesn't mean anything. So if you can talk to people, get what they want, dial it in, have them play, and then start getting notes, start getting feedback from them, that tends to be the most successful way to go. And I found if you do that, if you use that approach, then most people will give you time with individual instruments later on if you need it. So that's sound check. As we're doing sound check, as we're starting to mix the show, as we're starting to kind of create the sound that the audience is going to hear, we go back to our philosophy of getting to good first. Did we achieve good sound? Is it clean? Is it clear? Is it free of noise and feedback? Is it at an appropriate volume for the show? Can we hear everything? Is there a place, have we created that place and space in frequency and in time for each instrument so everything has a little place to stand out and to shine? And does it sound like it looks? Did we create a sonic image that matches the stage? That is the end of my presentation. I hope there are questions.
There are. The first question is, how do you keep the artist off stage before you're ready?
So you asked, how do we keep the artist off stage before you're ready?
Yep.
Stage management is my answer to that. I mean, we're blessed at the Kennedy Center by having an amazing support team, amazing staff, and that's the answer. Is that we try really hard to have stage management help us with that. But that said, what I'll try to do is, as soon as an artist arrives, I'm going to bring them out on stage to be like, hey, are we close? Are we kind of getting what you want? What I don't want is to keep them off stage, them arrive and be like, oh, this is totally wrong. But it's a fine line because you need the space to get your work done, but you also want to get as much information as you can.
Okay, the next question is asking, what shortcuts do you take when the band turns up late and you have much less time to do the sound check?
Yeah, that's great. That goes back to sound checking without a band. So, you know, if you have instruments on stage, hopefully there's somebody on your crew that has some kind of musical talent that can play a little bit. Even if you don't have people to actually play the instruments well, you can get basic gain things set. All of the things we did with our compressors, with our high and low pass, all of that console setup we did allows that, so that when people show up late, or if they don't show up at all, that first song of the evening isn't a disaster. At least you have something in place. You have something you can shape and mold.
So the next question is asking, how do you determine which frequency you cut for feedback?
That's a good question. I find the using an app really helpful. I'm as much as I'm a sound guy, I'm also a very visual person. There are a ton of apps out there that will show you the visual spectrum, whether it's an FFT or other app. So I find that I mean, eventually you kind of develop the ear and you recognize certain frequencies, but it's always a great idea to have a spectrum analyzer of some kind going, so that you can just see what that problem frequency is.
Okay, the next question is asking, how can a person deal with nerves before the event starts?
Oh man, I don't know, and I'd love to find out. I mean, honestly, I think that's one of the cool things about this job, is that you still get nervous every day, because every day you're doing a show for 500 people. I think time helps. I think the more you do, the easier it gets. But there is still, and the other thing, somebody smart told me once, is that nervousness and excitement are really the same thing. It's just how you deal with it. So oftentimes, if I'm really nervous about a show, I'll try to get excited. It's like, yeah, I've got a crazy show with 1,000 inputs, and I can either be terrified or I can be really excited that I get to do something cool. So that's how I would deal with that.
Okay. The next question is asking, for sound checks, do you not request individual inputs at all, and do bands respond well to this approach?
I have found that. So that was a big change for me here. And I got to say, a part of that is working with jazz groups who have been touring for longer than I've been alive. None of them really want to spend more time in sound check than they have to. So some of them would just want to come out and noodle and play. And I found that was a great approach. So I found most bands are amenable to that. It doesn't always work, but I think it's a better process.
All right, the next question is asking, are the ratios of your compressors meant for an auto mix?
No, I think I don't fully understand. I don't fully understand auto mix. I'm sorry.
Okay, the person who wrote that, if you want to add into your question, just put it into chat and we can come back to that. I think that was it that had come in at this point. Raul or Tom, have you had any questions submitted in through your panel?
Not for me. Not for me.
Okay. All right, we'll just give it another second here to see if.
Okay.
Thank you, Dustin. That was a really great presentation. Yep, we have another question. How do you manage tour producers who try to do your job for you?
I mean, it's diplomacy. Like the gig is diplomacy, and that's an interesting question because it depends. If they're I try not to be confrontational. I don't think that that's useful. At the end of the day, the band will be gone and I'll still be here. So I don't want to have a bad day. There's no need for it. I like to think of everybody as a resource. So rather than have an adversarial relationship, if you're a producer, if you're somebody who works with a band and you listen to them every night, I'm going to try to use you as a resource as opposed to trying to fight against you. So I'm gonna ask. I'm gonna be like, hey, does this kind of sound right? Is this kind of what you're into? When I have trouble with that is usually about volume. We have sound level limits here for health and safety, and that's when I sometimes get into trouble with that. But the nice thing there is you can just point to policy and be like, look, it's not me, it's my employer. I can't make it louder, sorry. So that's really the only time I really get into issues with that. But I think trying to turn people into assets rather than it being adversarial is always good when you can.
Okay, wonderful. We have a few more questions that have come in. Someone's asking if there's a way that they can contact you with further questions. If you have an email address you might want to share.
Sure. Yeah. Do you want me to share that now? It's just it's Dustin Dunsmore at Gmail. Spelled all lowercase, no spaces.
Okay. The next question is about software. It's asking, what software are you using to multi-rack from the Madi USB interface?
So that usually comes with a show. I don't have that here, but that'll be something that I'll provide if someone else, if an outside group is using that. That's I don't have a particular software that I use. It's more a capability that we have, but that I don't necessarily utilize.
Okay, the next question is asking how often the shows in the room that you work in come with a front of house engineer and whether or not you work in the facility's other rooms.
No, so I'm one of two master technicians of the Terrace Theater, so this is where I am. So this is the only theater I work in. Before I had this position, I worked other rooms in the building and other venues. But since I've been here, I'm only working in the Terrace Theater, or I'm doing maintenance elsewhere in the building. We do often, not often, I would say maybe it's 10%, maybe less, maybe 5% of shows that have engineers. And again, I'm going to try to facilitate them. Like, they know what it wants to sound like. I'm going to do everything in my power to make their day easier. So I'm going to set up the console. However they want it, I'm going to ask them a ton of questions, and I'm just going to try to, when possible, I try to be next to them, or I have someone else next to them the whole time so that they never have to worry about how the console works. They never have to have a question. We're right there, and we can facilitate it.
Okay, a few more questions. What is your way to ring out the monitors?
So again, it would probably be, if we're talking about ringing out for feedback, it would be a similar to how we're ringing out, finding those problematic frequencies through some kind of app or through the ear. But I think having a spectrum and seeing it visually is how I like to work. So that's how I would do that if we're talking about getting the most gain before feedback. You don't always need the most gain before feedback, which I think is something that isn't always understood. So having that kind of your worst case scenario is useful. So you can create a graphic EQ that's your worst case scenario, but then you can utilize it or not utilize it. Sometimes the drastic cuts we might have to take in order to get the most gain before feedback is not going to give us our best sound. So while it's really useful to know where your limits are, you don't always need to drive it there or to have those protections in place. You can kind of have it as a tool, not necessarily something you always need.
Okay, the next question is, do you take any additional steps to prepare for wireless gear?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I should have mentioned this in when we were talking about the input list phase part of the seminar, is that we have built into our system 16 channels of wireless mics. So they're kind of always in the room. They're always set up. The frequencies are mostly coordinated. This building can be tricky because there's so much going on that I often start the day by just checking, making sure frequencies aren't being utilized elsewhere. But for the most part, it's kind of nice. It's not something I have to worry about. But we do, I do have everything. I do have my my system networked, so I can use a program like Wireless Workbench to see what frequencies are working, if there's any kind of issue. And if I'm bringing in extra gear, I'll have all of that networked in with my wireless gear, so that everything works seamlessly. Same thing with IEMs. We have a couple wireless IEMs, and that's all on that same network, so that we can use the network functions to coordinate everything. The other thing with groups and within award shows where we have a large amount of wireless mics, or a panel discussion with a large amount of wireless mics, grouping those can be really useful, because you can find a graphic EQ to help with feedback and apply that to the entire group rather than having to do it parametrically to each channel. So those are some things I'll do for wireless mics.
Okay, we have another question. When you have specific room dynamics and the artist is demanding something that goes against the room, how do you handle that?
I don't know that I fully room dynamics. So the only I'm trying to think of what that would mean. Our particular room dynamics are that we're a recital hall. So one of the biggest challenges I have in this room is that it is essentially a recital hall that's also a great concert venue. So what that means is that stage volume is transferred very efficiently to the house. So if the stage is very loud, there's no button I have to turn it down. Where I run into issues there are really loud monitor levels. So this could be an issue where I need to talk, and that's what I'm going to do. It's not a technical issue. It's a communication issue, and I'm going to have to talk to the group, talk to the band, and this comes up with monitor levels. This comes up with guitar amps or bass amps, and be like, hey, I can't hear the vocal over your XYZ, over your monitor, over your amplifier. So in order to do the best possible show, we need to kind of come up with the solution together. Some things we'll do are move amps off stage and try to use a monitor to reinforce that. So again, it just becomes back to, I think, working with an artist, working with a group, working with their manager to try to come up with a solution together. But I think that's probably the stage volume is probably the dynamic issue I have the most of in this space.
Okay, the next question is asking, how do you approach front fills and why are they fed with stereo signals?
Great question. Again, for why it's stereo is that they wrap around the stage, and for me, the stereo image is a really vital thing. I really like to have a cohesive stereo image. So having stereo control over that, I find really useful. How I have it, normally I have it as it's a matrix send, and I'm just sending my my music and my vocal there. So it's getting the same music. It's getting the same music mix as everything else, but it might have a different relationship of vocal than another zone. But it'll track, because it's stereo, it'll track the panning of the rest of the mix.
Okay, we have somebody asking if you use plexiglass for your drum kit.
Yeah, whenever I can. It becomes an aesthetic issue with a lot of people, but again, because it's a very efficient room acoustically, it is really useful to have a drum shield whenever possible, especially if we have anybody who's loud. That's often one of the bigger problems I have is trying to get vocals over drums. If I have a rock and roll drummer, that's all you're going to hear.
Okay, I have another question that's a multi-part. If you are doing monitors from front of house and you use duplicate inputs, how do you treat the monitor layer? Do you copy most of the EQ, dynamics, et cetera, or not? And if not, how do you manage to have time for that?
So I would not copy as much as possible. I would, I mean, the time is what it is. You do as much as you can, but I don't think it's useful to have the same EQ, to have the same dynamics as you want for front of house. Front of house, you're making something musical, and in monitors, you're helping people hear themselves. So I think it's very different, and I think that's where, honestly, I think that's the advantage of having those separate inputs. If you were just to copy everything, you could just use an auxiliary mix of your front of house channels and create your monitor mix that way. But the advantage of having the separate channels and that separate layer is to be able to have all of those discrete. So you can have a discrete EQ for monitors. You can have a different compression scheme or no compression for monitors. Also for effects, I find a lot of people want different or no effects in their monitors than they do front of house. So I would try to keep it as clean as possible and only bring in things when I need them.
Okay, the next question is asking, do you flip the stereo image in the front fills to match with the mains at the sides of the stage?
Yeah, I wanted to track the PA. Yeah, I wanted to track the left and the right.
Okay, here's another question. How does your approach change for different productions, say opera or live theater?
Yeah, I mean, it's for opera, 9 times out of the 10, you are not so much, they're gonna do the show. Like their instruments are unamplified, and honestly, what you're doing for opera is you are a AV tech. You are making sure that they can hear themselves. You're making sure that they can see themselves. When we do opera in this room, it's a lot of cameras. It's a lot of monitoring for groups that are off stage. It's a lot of making sure that the dressing room sound is right. It's honestly a lot of comm. So it's with opera, it's more about the ancillary stuff more than it is about at front of house. At front of house, I might have a couple mics from the pit. There might be something in the pit that isn't balanced. We were for a while doing a children's opera or an opera geared towards younger audiences, I should say. And there was often 1 or 2 young performers. So that was kind of a unique challenge where we'd have to mic one singer, which seems simple, but it's actually it's quite tricky to get that balance right, where one person is mic'd, a child is mic'd, and everyone else is acoustic. For theater, that's a whole different ball game with wireless mics, and there's a whole protocol of kind of the Broadway style of mixing. We do a lot of dance, so there's a lot of playback. I'll have a QLab set up for that kind of thing. Yeah, so it's a different. What goes into the console is different for everything, but there are there's a good amount of overlap.
Okay, here's another multi-parter for you. Do you have an RTA constantly running while the show is ongoing? Also, how do you not become over-reliant to what is shown on the readings and trust on instinct?
I do not have an RTA going typically. It's something I had set up, but I just didn't. It's not something I find useful during a show. It's an incredible tool for setting up a system. But for actually mixing a show, you can get, when I said attention is a limited resource, I think it's easy to overwhelm yourself. And digital consoles are amazing, but there's a lot to look at. So I don't find it useful. It's not something it's not part of my workflow for a live show.
Okay, what is the ideal position in the audience for sound check?
For you to be, or for so I assume I'm going to answer if I'm going to assume that means what's the best position in the audience to mix the show. I hope that's what you mean. If not, let me know. More often than not, you don't have a choice. The console is where it is based on where they've sold seats. Obviously, you want to be in the primary listening environment of the theater. You want to make sure that you hear the same thing as the people who are paying money to hear the show. If what you hear is radically different than what it sounds like in the seats, then how do you even know what you're doing? How are you creating value for the people buying tickets if what you're mixing isn't what they're hearing? I'm lucky here that when we set up the theater, the mix position is in a great location, and the PA, all the elements of the PA hit the mix position. So I feel confident that what I'm hearing is similar to or the same to what the audience is hearing.
Okay, do you use parallel compression? If yes, how do you set it up?
That is not a thing I use. With the whole stage plot to Doors in 5 hours, simplicity is key, and that's not a technique that I found particularly useful for jazz or the things that we use. But that's not a tool that I use.
Okay, I have another multi-parter for you. How is the change of technology really changing how things work in terms of putting on a show? In what way is it being made better, and what might be taken away from the job?
Well, the digital consoles certainly increase workflow and help simplify workflow. Being able to have everything networked so that if something goes down, if something stops working, you can swap it out is incredibly useful. We certainly see video as becoming an integral part of just about every show we do, which I think is great. It's a new visual element. The recording has certainly gotten not easier, but maybe even easier. I mean, it's much easier to get sound out of something. Yeah, okay, so that interesting answer to that is I think expectations. When we do shows that are more a community award show or a corporate presentation, I get a lot of people asking me to play songs off of YouTube or to use a streaming service or that kind of thing, or play songs from their iPhone. So I think what becomes tricky in a digital environment is talking about audio quality and trying to explain why something that sounds fine playing from YouTube from your phone probably is not going to sound great at 90 dB coming out of a PA. Those are some things that are tricky. But I think for the most part, the technology makes our lives easier.
Okay, we have a few more questions. Are you good with time for a few more?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Wonderful. Do you have a standard bass frequency EQ template to help reduce feedback before anything really gets going for setup?
Yeah, I have some things for my wireless mics, and it's really about the input itself. So I know that if I have, and it depends. So it depends on a lot of things. So I know if I have an orchestra show, that is another way we set up the theater. And getting a lavalier mic to not be a disaster in the orchestra show requires a lot of tweaking. So that's something I'll keep in my back pocket, and that's something I use the library function of the VI to have that ready to go. So again, it's my input. I know that a handheld 58 has a certain things that are problematic in my room, and I'll keep certain things in the channel strip that way. So in my base file, I have all my wireless mics, or a selection of my wireless mics ready to go with bass compression, with probably not an EQ per se, but with a high-low pass already set up. And I'll in the library function, I'll have things that I've used in the past that I can just drag and drop over.
Okay. What's the best mic layout in a room to feed audience and room noise into IEMs or records?
So I usually don't, it's rare that I am doing miking just for IEMs. So the mics are gonna have to be, I guess, a compromise for what's gonna sound good for the PA and everything else. With IEMs, I will not, I do not feel comfortable mixing IEMs for front of house. It's just, it's one thing if a wedge gets too loud. If you have IEMs in somebody's ears and your volume gets out of control for even a second, you can cause permanent damage to musicians. So that's not something I would feel comfortable doing from front of house, and I'm going to want to have a dedicated engineer who has ears in and is hearing what they're hearing. But they're going to use the same inputs that we're using. We're going to share inputs unless there's a reason not to.
Okay, this is a question asking, do you also use floor mics across the front of the stage in addition to shotguns? And how do you keep out the noises that you don't want, such as footsteps or moving chairs?
Great question. Again, your low pass, your low cut high pass filter is a great way for getting the rumbling out of mics across the stage. We'll occasionally do that. It's not that that's not something I'll use for a musical act. But if we have a theater group maybe who's doing a play reading and they don't want, or because of the nature of it, we can't individually mic each person, we'll set up some floor mics, especially if we're then going to simulcast that. Yeah, so a low pass is a great way to get rid of all that. And you just kind of have to listen and see what those frequencies are that are going to rumble around and be problematic. Maybe it's the mid-range. Again, it's just listening. Shotguns so I use shotgun mics for my recording for my page program feed. Don't think I've ever put them in the PA. It just seems risky. But I have shotgun mics on my balcony rail and in my lighting position that are useful for recording. And for sending to the backstage mix.
All right, another multi-parter. What do you like to see least in terms of pre-production or on-site paperwork from an act? What's the least and the most helpful?
The least helpful is no paperwork or paperwork that is outdated. The most helpful is a detailed input list of what, a microphone wish list is great. Like if you tell me all your dream mics, I'm probably not going to have them, and there might not be budget to rent them, but at least I know where you're coming from, what you want. So an input list of like exactly what we're miking, what you have had success with, or what you'd like on that is really useful. A detailed stage plot that just shows where things are laid out is great. Really detailed backline is huge. Since everything has to be rented, that is really useful.
Okay, do you ring out each zone one at a time or all of them at once?
For setting levels to the system. So that's something, honestly, that's something that we do. That's not a daily occurrence, and that's part of how that's part of how we get so fast, is that we don't have to worry about the PA for the most part. I mean, we check the PA, but you know that the room is balanced, so you don't have to worry about that. That's something that we do, that was done when we set up the room. And it's something you verify and check, but for the most part, you're trusting that your mix sounds good. And then as the show goes on, as you're at a point where you can leave the desk, you can then walk the room and listen to each zone. And that's where that that method of having both the left, right mix and the vocals go to each section. As you walk to each section, you can adjust up and down in each section. But for the most part, that setup is not something I'm having to do or have time to do each day. That's all taken care of long ago.
Okay, here's a question about any tricks for vocal mics when it comes to rappers. Do these acts tend to be very loud on stage at your venue?
Yes. God, I wish I knew. I mean, you got to go with the genre. Like, you're not gonna change mic technique. It sounds the way. You're not gonna convince somebody to hold the microphone a different way. That's part of the performance. That's the art. The problem I get into is volume. We have a sound limit, and even without a policy, like there's a certain point where it is beyond unhelpful. It's dangerous. So getting it to sound right at a lower volume is the challenge I deal with, and often it's changing the relationship of the subs to the rest of the system while keeping the overall system volume in check. Maybe changing some of that relationship can be helpful, and dealing with stage volume. That becomes really tricky with hip hop and rap is the stage volume.
Okay, we're going to do one last question. When checking monitors as a group, do you have a preferred order for working through specific instruments? No, honestly, it's the first person to show up. So like I said, I try to use every minute of stage time. So the first musician who shows up, we're going to talk to them. We're going to ask what they want to hear and try to dial that in. Then as more people get out, so like let's say the bass player shows up, I'm going to have myself or somebody I work with talk to them and say, hey, what do you like in your monitors? We're going to try to get that set up. And maybe the next person who shows up is the guitar player or the drummer. We're going to have them to, as soon as that guitar player starts noodling, we can kind of verify that there's a decent send to that bass player. So not a preferred order. Once everybody's up and running, once everybody's playing, we're going to tell them, hey, either, it's me front of house, wave your hand, and point up, point down, and I'll try to get you. Or I have somebody stage left on a monitor console, wave at them, point at the musician you want louder or lower, and they will help you out. So again, I think to make things as fast as possible, honestly, an organic approach tends to work the best. You try to mix as soon as you can, whatever you can. Okay, I think we're at time. If there were additional questions, Dustin, it sounds like you were okay with them reaching out via email.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would really appreciate that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful presentation, and thank you everybody for attending. We really appreciate you participating in our workshop series. Just a reminder, if you want to check out the additional workshops, you can find those at pro.harman.com. Today's webinar and all of the webinars are recorded and will be available a few days after the live session. So thanks everyone. Have a great rest of your day. We appreciate you.